The freight wagon lurched through another frozen rut as it approached White River, South Dakota territory, its iron-reinforced wheels grinding against the hard earth of late October 1885. Behind the canvas cover, 20-year-old Cora Moravec clutched a dented metal box to her chest, her knuckles white with determination and terror. Inside that box lay documents that could topple the most powerful man in the Dakota Territory, or get her killed for possessing them. The ambush materialized from the cottonwood grove like death given form. 4 riders emerged with practiced precision, their mounts' breath steaming in the bitter air. The leader's left hand had been replaced by a cruel metal hook that caught the pale sunlight, while jagged scars carved tributaries of violence down the right side of his face. But it was something else that made Cora's blood freeze the way he sat his horse tilted slightly to the left, exactly as someone from her childhood had done. The recognition flickered and died before she could grasp it fully, leaving only unease in its wake. "Hold there, Pete." The scarred man called his voice, carrying absolute authority. "We're hunting cargo that don't rightfully belong to you." Lucky Pete, the grizzled freighter who had agreed to smuggle Cora away from Skull Canyon Mine, tightened his grip on the Winchester across his knees. "Just hauling supplies to town, Harry. Nothing here worth dying over." "That's where you're mistaken, old friend." The hook gleamed as Harry gestured toward the wagon bed. "Mr. Octavius Marrow is missing something precious, his promised bride and certain papers that walked off without permission." Beneath the rough canvas, Cora pressed herself against the wagon boards, heart hammering against her ribs. Through a gap in the covering, she watched the other 3 riders spread out with deadly efficiency, 2 carrying Spencer repeating rifles, 1 cradling a double-barreled shotgun. These were not common road agents, but professional manhunters, the kind who tracked fugitives for bounty gold and asked no questions about their employer's methods. Then Harry began to whistle a haunting Czech melody that Cora's father had sung to her as a child, the same tune someone else had hummed while whittling by the fire during brief visits. The sound pierced her like a blade, awakening memories she had buried so deep she had forgotten they existed. Her hands began to tremble for reasons that had nothing to do with the November cold. "The woman's got legal rights," Pete said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Can't force a bride into marriage she don't want." Harry's laugh held no warmth. "Rights, a woman's rights end where her guardian's signature begins, Pete. That marriage contract was signed proper and legal 8 years past. Time's come to honor it." "I won't be his property," Cora called out, rising from her hiding place despite the danger. The box remained clutched against her simple blue dress, like armor against despair. That contract was obtained through fraud and murder. Strong accusations from a runaway bride. Harry's scarred features twisted into something that might have been amusement. "Got proof to back such claims." Cora's fingers tightened on the metal box. Inside lay her father's surveying notes, water rights documents, and most damning of all, a letter written 3 days before his death, expressing terror for his safety. "I have everything Papa died trying to protect." As Harry studied her face with those pale eyes, he absently rubbed his remaining hand against his thigh, a nervous habit that made Cora's breath catch. Someone from her past had done the same thing when thinking usually before making some reckless decision. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of family gatherings before her father's death, that she nearly cried out. But before she could voice her growing suspicion, the morning erupted into violence. From a low ridge perhaps 200 yards distant, Ohiteka Swift Elk, to his Lakota people had been watching the confrontation unfold with the patience of a natural predator. At 35 winters, he bore the weathered look of a man who had spent half his life between 2 worlds, serving as an army scout until the slaughter at Little Bighorn had sickened him of white man's warfare. The nightmares still came to him in the dark hours before dawn, the screams of warriors and soldiers dying in the Montana grass, The smell of burning teepees, the weight of the cavalry uniform that had made him complicit in a war that solved nothing. He had hung up his blue coat and sought solitude in the wilderness, trapping along Red Oak Creek and trading hides, seeking the peace that had eluded him since that terrible June morning 9 years past. But watching the scene below, he remembered another day 10 years past when he had knelt beside a sobbing 10-year-old girl at her father's graveside and spoken words that had seemed like simple comfort. "Don't cry, little one. When you grow tall enough to outrun the creek in spring flood, I'll make sure no one can harm you." The townspeople had heard it as a marriage promise, but to Ohiteka, raised in a culture where words carried sacred weight, it had been a covenant. The girl had grown tall indeed, and now his promise faced its ultimate test. The first shot cracked across the prairie like thunder. Lucky Pete toppled from his seat with blood spreading across his coat, while the horses reared and snorted in terror. Harry's men opened fire with disciplined precision, their bullets splintering wood and sending Cora diving for cover beneath the wagon boards. Ohiteka's response was swift and deadly. His Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession clean shots that dropped one bandit instantly and sent another tumbling from his panicked mount. By the time he reached the wagon at a full gallop, his paint pony dancing with battle fury, only Harry and one gunman remained. Swift elk. Harry snarled, his hook glinting as he fought to control his rearing horse. "Should have known you'd stick your nose into white man's business." "The woman is under my protection," Ohiteka replied calmly, his rifle trained on Harry's chest. "Your protection don't mean spit in territorial court, savage. What you got is romantic notions and a Winchester that won't help you against the law." But Lucky Pete, dying and desperate, had one final card to play. His trembling hand found the stick of dynamite tucked beneath his seat insurance against road agents and claim jumpers. With his last breath, he lit the fuse and hurled it toward Harry's position. The explosion sent Harry's horse screaming into eternity and hurled its rider 20 feet through the air to land broken among the sagebrush. The surviving gunman's mount bolted for the horizon, carrying its rider away from the carnage at a dead run. In the aftermath, with smoke and dust settling over the prairie, Cora found herself staring at the man who had honored a decade-old promise. Ohiteka sat his paint with casual grace, his weapon ready, but no longer needed his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons beyond simple gratitude. "Thank you." She whispered the words inadequate for what had transpired. "Don't thank me yet, little bird. This was just the opening move. Marrow won't give up easy, and his reach extends far beyond these badlands." As if to underscore his warning, Harry stirred among the brush, his hook scraping stone as he struggled upright. Blood ran from his nose and ears, but his eyes burned with undiminished hatred. "This ain't finished." He gasped, his voice thick with pain and fury. "Marrow's got judges and lawmen from here to Denver. You can run, but you can't hide from territorial justice." Something in his voice, the way he pronounced certain words, with the faint trace of a Czech accent, made Cora's blood turn to ice. But before she could examine the memory more closely, Ohiteka put another bullet into the ground near Harry's head, sending the wounded man scrambling for better cover. As they rode away from the scene of carnage, Cora clinging to Ohiteka's waist while Lucky Pete's body grew small behind them. She carried with her not only the precious evidence that could destroy Marrow's empire, but also a growing certainty that Hook Hand Harry was connected to her family in ways too terrible to contemplate. The game was set, the players revealed, and somewhere in the frozen Dakota landscape lay either Vindication or an unmarked grave for Václav Moravec's daughter and the Lakota Warrior who had sworn to protect her. The abandoned homestead squatted against the winter landscape like the bones of broken dreams, its log walls chinked with mud and moss, its single window covered with oiled paper that admitted only the dimmest light. Inside, a small fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with traps and tools, the simple implements needed to scratch a living from unforgiving earth. Cora sat on a three-legged stool beside the fire, her torn dress muddy and her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders after their desperate flight. The precious metal box rested on her knees, its dented surface reflecting the flames. Despite exhaustion that went bone deep, her blue eyes held the alertness of a hunted animal. Ohiteka stood near the papered window, his Winchester within easy reach. He had removed the traditional paint from his weathered face, revealing features that bore witness to both his Lakota heritage and the hard years spent serving between worlds. In the firelight, his weathered hands showed the small scars that came from a lifetime of handling weapons and tools with equal skill. The nightmares had been worse lately, since taking up arms again in defense of this Czech girl who reminded him too much of the children who had died during the years of warfare. In the small hours before dawn, he would wake with the taste of gunpowder in his mouth and the screams of the innocent echoing in his ears. Perhaps that was why he had chosen to live alone, trapping the isolated creeks where the only sounds were wind and water. "Tell me about the box," he said without turning from his vigil. Cora's fingers traced the metal surface, feeling dents and scratches that marked its journey from safety to peril. "My father, Václav Moravec, died in Skull Canyon Mine 5 years ago. Cave-in, they claimed, though Papa was too skilled to be caught without warning by falling rock. Men die in mines. The earth is always hungry. Not Papa." Her voice carried absolute conviction. He knew stone and timber like you know weather signs and animal tracks. He taught me to read the mountain's moods, to listen for whispers that warn of danger. Someone wanted him dead. The memory came flooding back, her father's gentle hands, showing her how to test timber for rot, how the sound changed when wood was ready to fail. He had been meticulous, careful, the kind of miner who lived to gray-haired old age, because he never took unnecessary risks. Why kill a miner? The Black Hills are full of men digging for gold. Because Papa discovered something more valuable than gold dust. She opened the metal container with reverent care, revealing papers tied with string. Water rights. Papa filed claims on Red Oak Creek just days before he died. That creek feeds the sluices that wash gold from Merrow's operation. Control the water, control the mine. And with your father dead, the claims would become territorial property. Unless he had a legal heir. Cora's smile held no warmth. Which he did. Me. Ohiteka moved closer, his moccasined feet silent on the packed earth floor. The nightmares that plagued his sleep seemed lighter somehow, when he focused on this immediate problem, this living person who needed protection, rather than the ghosts of the dead who could never be saved. "So Merrow arranged your father's death and your guardianship in the same stroke. My stepfather, Zachary Vaslevik, sold my guardianship to settle gambling debts. The marriage contract binds me to Merrow on my 20th birthday." She paused, remembering. Zachary disappeared not long after Papa died. Some said he fled to Colorado, others claimed he'd been killed over his debts. I never saw him again. But you remember him. Fragments. He was Papa's younger brother, but they were different as night and day. Papa was steady, responsible. Zachary was restless, always gambling, always looking for the easy fortune. He had this nervous habit of rubbing his hand against his leg when he was thinking, and he used to whistle old Czech melodies from when they were boys. Her voice grew troubled. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about him lately, but I can't place why. The door opened with a creak of leather hinges, admitting cold air, and Dr. Henry Thomas, who moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to being welcome wherever healing was needed. His weathered bag hung from his shoulder, like a badge of office earned through decades of frontier doctoring. Cora, child, thank Providence you're safe. He set his bag on the rough table and began removing instruments with practiced efficiency. Half the territory's been in an uproar since word spread about the shooting. Dr. Thomas. Cora rose to embrace the man who had delivered her into the world and served as the closest thing to family she had known since her father's death. How did you find us? Alessandro saw Swift Elk riding toward the Badlands with a woman behind him. Didn't take much reasoning to figure who it might be. The doctor's eyes moved to Ohiteka with professional interest. You hurt, son. Nothing that won't heal. Let me be the judge of that. Henry's voice carried quiet authority. Sit and let me examine that arm. As Henry worked, cleaning the bullet graze with whiskey and binding it with strips of clean cloth, Cora found herself studying Ohiteka's face. There was something haunted in his dark eyes, a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. She had heard whispers about what had happened at Little Bighorn, about the Lakota scouts who had quit the army rather than participate in what they saw as a war with no honor on either side. The nightmares will fade, she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Ohiteka's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there, the understanding that passed between people who had both lost innocence to violence they could not prevent. Do they fade, I mean? The sharp edges do, but you never forget entirely. She touched the metal box. Papa used to say that some wounds heal stronger than the original flesh if you give them time and don't pick at them. Before Ohiteka could respond, the door opened again to admit Pauline Fletcher, the territorial schoolteacher whose presence commanded immediate respect. Behind her came Alessandro Rossetti, his weathered face creased with worry and determination. Brought news, Pauline announced, setting a covered pot near the fire. None of it particularly encouraging, I'm afraid. What news? Cora asked, though she suspected she already knew. Acting Sheriff Dave Sutton's been spreading word about a runaway bride and stolen documents, making it sound like helping you would be the same as harboring a common thief. Dark Dave. Henry muttered, his voice tight with disgust. Man's morals are about as solid as quicksand. Real sheriff died of lung fever last winter, and Dave bought his way into the appointment with Merrow's money. Alessandro moved to warm his hands by the fire, his expression grim. It's worse than just talk. Dave's organizing a posse offering $20 to any man willing to ride after you. In times like these, that's more cash than most have seen in months. $20. Cora whispered. Enough to feed a family through the winter, enough to make good men consider betraying neighbors they had known for years. We need to move, Ohiteka said quietly. Tonight, while the weather holds. Once a proper blizzard hits, we'll be trapped wherever we shelter. Move where? Dr. Henry asked. Merrow's influence extends throughout the territory. There's nowhere we can hide indefinitely. Then we don't hide, Cora said, her voice gaining strength with each word. We prove the claims are legitimate and expose Merrow's crimes. The Territorial Land Office in Bismarck will have records if Papa really filed before he died. Bismarck's 3 hard days' ride, Alessandro observed. And they'll be watching every main trail. Then we don't take the main trails, Ohiteka replied. We go through country where only spirits and the very desperate dare to walk. As they planned through the night, using maps drawn from memory and knowledge earned through years of hard travel, Cora found herself studying each face by firelight. These people had chosen to stand with her against overwhelming odds, risking everything for principles that seemed increasingly rare in a world dominated by money and power. But even as gratitude warmed her heart, the echo of Harry's whistling haunted her thoughts. That melody, so achingly familiar, carried with it the weight of childhood memories and growing suspicions too terrible to voice aloud. Dawn came gray and threatening, promising the kind of weather that could kill the unprepared as efficiently as any bullet. But it also brought concealment the chance to move across the landscape, unseen by enemies who preferred warm saloons to the rigors of winter tracking. They rode into the teeth of the gathering storm. 3 figures against the vast indifference of the Dakota sky, carrying with them evidence that could reshape the balance of power throughout the territory. If they could survive long enough to present it to someone who cared more about justice than profit. The Badlands stretched around them like a frozen hell, all wind-carved spires and treacherous ravines, where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into canyons deep enough to hide their bones forever. The storm that had provided cover for their escape from White River had intensified during the night driving snow before it, with the fury of a living thing determined to scour the earth clean. Ohiteka's paint pony picked its way along a trail that existed more in memory than reality, following paths known to his people for countless generations. Behind him, Cora clung to his waist, with numbed fingers her body pressed against his back for warmth and balance. The cold had long since penetrated their hastily assembled clothing. But neither complained. They both understood that discomfort was preferable to the alternative that waited if they were caught. Doctor. Henry rode a borrowed horse 20 yards behind his medical bag, replaced by saddlebags filled with supplies and ammunition. Despite his age and soft living, the physician was proving remarkably resilient, though Cora could see the strain in his face whenever she glanced back. It was during their second day in the Badlands that they encountered their first real test. The settlement of Prairie Junction consisted of little more than a trading post, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of weathered buildings clustered around a crossroads where freight wagons stopped to rest and resupply. Under normal circumstances, they would have avoided such places entirely, but their horses needed grain, and their own supplies were running dangerously low. We go in quiet, buy what we need, and leave, Ohiteka instructed, as they observed the settlement from a ridge overlooking the crude main street. No talk beyond what's necessary for business. But even as they tied their horses outside the trading post, Cora sensed that something was wrong. The few locals they encountered watched them with the calculating interest of people who had recently heard descriptions worth remembering. When the storekeeper quoted prices that were twice the normal rate, she knew their presence had been noted and evaluated. It was the telegraph key's frantic tapping from the back room that confirmed their worst fears. "Time to leave," Ohiteka said quietly, his hand moving to rest on his rifle stock. They were mounting their horses when the first shot rang out from the direction of the blacksmith shop. A man with a Spencer rifle had taken position behind the forge, while another crouched behind a water trough with a shotgun that could cut a man in half at close range. $20 says that's them. The blacksmith called out, his voice tight with greed and excitement. "Hold them for the sheriff, and we split the bounty." What followed was a running gun battle through the muddy streets of Prairie Junction, with desperate shots exchanged between storefronts, while terrified horses plunged and reared. Ohiteka's military training served them well, his return fire forcing their attackers to seek better cover, while he maneuvered his companions toward the edge of town. The turning point came when Dr. Henry, despite his physician's oath, put a bullet through the blacksmith's shoulder that sent him spinning away from his weapon with a scream of pain and surprise. In the confusion that followed, they escaped into the swirling snow, but not before Cora had seen the telegraph operator frantically tapping out their description to stations throughout the territory. "We can't stop again," Ohiteka said as they pushed deeper into the storm. "Not until we reach the capital." The next 2 days passed in a blur of cold exhaustion and constant vigilance. They sheltered where they could in abandoned homesteads, cave mouths and wind-carved hollows that provided minimal protection from the elements. Their supplies dwindled steadily, forcing them to melt snow for water, and stretch their remaining food until each meal consisted of little more than a few strips of jerky. But it was during their second night in the Badlands, huddled around a tiny fire in a natural shelter formed by fallen boulders, that Cora made a discovery that changed everything. She had been examining her father's papers by firelight, looking for details that might strengthen their case before the Territorial Land Office, when she found a letter she had never seen before. Written in her father's careful hand and dated just 1 week before his death, it was a draft of correspondence that had never been sent hidden among the water rights documents, like a guilty secret. The letter was addressed to Octavius Marrow himself, and its contents made her blood freeze in her veins. "I am prepared to negotiate the sale of my water rights claims," she read in Czech, translating the words that shattered everything she had believed about her father's courage. "My daughter and I wish only to leave the territory safely. Name your price, and we can resolve this matter without further unpleasantness." The letter was never sent, which meant her father had written it in a moment of fear, but ultimately chosen to resist. But it also meant that Václav Moravec, the man she had idolized as a paragon of integrity and courage, had been prepared to abandon his principles and flee rather than fight for justice. "What is it?" Ohiteka asked, noting the tears that had begun to freeze on her cheeks. She handed him the letter, watching his face as he read the Czech words slowly, his limited knowledge of the language sufficient to grasp the devastating meaning. "Your father," he said finally. "He tried to make a deal. He was going to run away." Cora whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of understanding. "All these years I thought he died as a hero standing up to corruption. But he was ready to sell out and flee like a coward." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, destroying the image of saintly martyrdom that had sustained her through years of grief and months of desperate struggle. Her father had not died as a hero, he had died as a failed collaborator, killed by men who had no use for his cooperation once they realized they could simply take what they wanted by force. But even as this terrible knowledge threatened to break her spirit entirely, Ohiteka's weathered hand covered hers with gentle strength. "Fear doesn't make a man a coward," he said quietly. "It makes him human. Your father wrote that letter because he loved you more than his principles. That's not weakness, it's the strongest kind of courage there is." But he was going to give up everything Papa believed in. No, he was going to give up everything except what mattered most, your safety. The letter was never sent, which means that in the end, he chose to fight rather than run. Maybe he realized that some things can't be bought with safety, or maybe he just couldn't live with himself if he taught his daughter that justice could be abandoned whenever the price got too high. Cora stared at the letter through her tears, seeing it now not as evidence of cowardice, but as proof of the terrible choices that love sometimes demanded. Her father had been neither saint nor coward, but something more complex and human. A man trying to balance idealism with pragmatism, courage with caution, love for his daughter with loyalty to his principles. He had failed in the end, but he had failed while trying to protect what mattered most to him. And that, she was beginning to understand, might be the most heroic thing of all. "I still have to finish what he started," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Yes," Ohiteka agreed. "But now you know why it matters. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human enough to make mistakes and still keep fighting when it counted." As the wind howled through their shelter and the snow continued to fall, Cora felt something shift inside her chest. The scared girl who had been running from her father's legacy was fading, replaced by a woman who understood that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Tomorrow they would reach Bismarck and learn whether her father's water rights claims were legitimate. But tonight she had learned something more valuable than legal documents, that heroes weren't made from perfection, but from the choice to keep fighting even when hope seemed lost. The accounting that waited ahead would be her father's vindication and her own coming of age, written in whatever blood the Dakota Territory demanded as payment for justice. The territorial capital of Bismarck rose from the prairie like a monument to federal authority, its brick buildings and wide streets, testament to the kind of order that politicians promised but rarely delivered. Smoke from dozens of chimneys painted gray lines against the November sky, while the constant traffic of freight wagons and mounted riders spoke of a community that had grown beyond its frontier origins. The land office occupied a substantial building on the main street, its windows glowing with lamplight as clerks worked through the evening hours processing the endless paperwork that territorial expansion demanded. Inside, behind a counter worn smooth by countless supplicants, Chief Clerk Benjamin Hartwell presided over the bureaucratic machinery that transformed wilderness into legally recognized property. Cora stood before that counter. Now her father's documents spread across its scarred surface like an indictment of everything corrupt in territorial governance. Despite the exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees, her voice remained steady as she presented evidence that could reshape the balance of power throughout the Black Hills. Water rights claim on Red Oak Creek, Hartwell muttered, running his finger down columns of entries in a leather-bound ledger that seemed to contain the dreams and disappointments of half the territory. Filed by one Václav Moravec, dated March 12, 1880. 5 days before my father died. Cora said, her heart racing with excitement and dread in equal measure. Indeed so. Filed, properly signed, and witnessed fee paid in full? Hartwell looked up from the ledger with the expression of a man who had witnessed too many dreams founder on legal technicalities. However, the claim was never finalized due to circumstances. What circumstances? Dr. Henry asked, his voice sharp with concern. Death certificate came through before the paperwork could be completed. Territory doesn't recognize water rights claims from deceased persons, so the matter was set aside pending resolution of estate issues. Cora felt hope crumble like ancient parchment in her hands. So the claim is worthless. Didn't say worthless. Said set aside. Hartwell's thin smile suggested professional satisfaction at watching emotions rise and fall with his words. Claims still perfectly valid if there's a legal heir who can prove descent and pay the outstanding processing fees. How much? Ohiteka asked quietly. $37.25, including penalties for late filing. The sum might as well have been $1,000. Cora's worldly wealth consisted of the clothes on her back and perhaps $4 in small coins. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Ohiteka was reaching for the leather pouch at his belt where he kept gold and silver earned through years of patient trapping. I can cover the fees, he said simply. Hartwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. What's your interest in this particular claim? Miss Moravec is under my protection. Something warm unfurled in Cora's chest at the quiet certainty in his voice, at the simple generosity of a gesture that asked nothing in return. When their eyes met across the counter, she saw something there that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with gratitude, a depth of feeling that had been growing unspoken through their shared trials. Very well, Hartwell said, sweeping the coins into his cash drawer. Though I should warn you that having legal paperwork and being able to enforce it are different propositions entirely. Octavius Marrow has deep pockets and long reach throughout the territory. They were descending the office steps, precious water rights documents tucked safely in Cora's coat when the shooting started. The first bullet shattered the glass door behind them, sending sharp fragments flying like deadly confetti. The second shot splintered wooden railings and caused pedestrians to dive for cover behind whatever shelter they could find. From an alley across the street, muzzle flashes revealed their attackers' positions. "Down!" Ohiteka shouted, pushing Cora toward the dubious protection of a horse trough, while drawing his Winchester with fluid speed. His hand lingered on her shoulder a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the warmth of his touch, even through her coat. Deputy Tobias Mueller crouched behind a pile of freight barrels, his young face pale with fear as he worked the lever of his Springfield carbine. Beside him, two of Merrow's hired gunmen maintained steady fire with the mechanical precision of professionals who had practiced their trade until it became instinct. "Give up the woman, swift elk." Tobias called out, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Sheriff's orders come peaceful and nobody gets hurt." Ohiteka's response was a precisely aimed shot that sent splinters flying from the barrel, sheltering the young deputy. "Tell Dave he can present his warrants to a federal judge." The gunfight that followed transformed Bismarck's main street into a battlefield, with innocent bystanders fleeing in all directions while combatants used storefronts and freight wagons for cover. Dr. Henry, despite his lack of military experience, proved remarkably effective with his rifle, his medical knowledge allowing him to place shots that disabled rather than killed. During a lull in the firing, as both sides reloaded their weapons, Cora found herself pressed close to Ohiteka behind their makeshift shelter. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his buckskin shirt. When he glanced down at her, checking for injuries, their faces were close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Stay down," he murmured, and she heard something in his voice that spoke of more than simple protective duty. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, and meant it in more ways than one. It was Dr. Henry who ended the confrontation by putting a bullet through a kerosene barrel near the attacker's position. When Ohiteka's next shot ignited the spreading fuel, the resulting fire forced their enemies to abandon their positions or risk being burned alive. In the confusion that followed, with half the town fighting the spreading flames, the three fugitives reached their horses and rode out of Bismarck at a hard gallop. As they fled, Ohiteka reached back to steady Cora behind him, his strong hand covering hers where it gripped his belt. "Where do we go now?" she asked, as they slowed their horses to a sustainable pace. "To the source," Ohiteka replied grimly. "To Skull Canyon Mine, where this all started." "That's suicide. Merrow will have 50 armed men there." "Maybe so. But it's also where we'll find the evidence that proves your father was murdered. Legal documents are one thing, witnesses and proof of conspiracy are another entirely." Dr. Henry, riding behind them with blood seeping from a bullet graze on his arm, managed a weak smile. Sometimes the most dangerous course is the only one that leads to safety. As they rode toward the Black Hills and whatever waited for them among the mine shafts and ore dumps of Skull Canyon, Cora felt the weight of approaching confrontation settling on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, the growing certainty that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The final accounting was at hand, and only one side would survive to see justice done. The Black Hills rose before them like sleeping giants, wrapped in mantles of snow and shadow. Their slopes dark with pine and aspen, their peaks lost in clouds that promised more harsh weather to come. Somewhere among those peaks, carved into living rock by the desperate labor of men who measured their lives in ounces of gold, lay Skull Canyon Mine and the confrontation that would decide whether justice or corruption would triumph in the Dakota Territory. They had been riding for 2 days since fleeing Bismarck, following game trails and hidden paths that Ohiteka knew from his years as an Army scout. The country grew more desolate with each mile marked by the bones of failed homesteads and the rusted remnants of mining claims that had promised fortune but delivered only broken dreams. It was during their second night in the hills sheltering in a cave that showed signs of ancient use by Ohiteka's people that Dr. Henry made the discovery that would reshape their understanding of Mero's criminal empire. "Look at this," he said, holding up a newspaper he had taken from a discarded saddlebag found outside the cave. The paper was 3 weeks old from a mining town in Colorado, but the headline made Cora's blood run cold. "Mine owner dies in suspicious accident," she read aloud. Heinrich Müller, proprietor of the Silver Dollar Mine, was killed when a charge of black powder exploded prematurely. Authorities suspect sabotage in connection with a disputed water rights claim. "Müller," Henry said grimly. "Same name as Deputy Tobias back in White River. Could be coincidence, but probably isn't," Ohiteka finished. "How many other miners have died in accidents when they got too close to water rights that Mero wanted?" The implications were staggering. If Mero had been systematically murdering claim holders throughout the territory, then Václav Moravec's death was not an isolated crime, but part of a pattern of violence extending across multiple states and territories. "We need proof," Cora said, studying the newspaper with new understanding. "Not just suspicions or theories, but evidence that will convince federal authorities to act. That evidence will be in Mero's office," Henry observed. "Correspondence, financial records, instructions to his killers. Men like Mero keep detailed records of their crimes. It's how they maintain control over their subordinates." "Then that's where we're going," Cora declared with grim determination. "Into the mine, into his office, and into whatever hell we have to face to get the truth." They spent the remainder of the night planning their approach, using Ohiteka's knowledge of mining operations and Cora's memories of her father's work routines to construct a strategy that might give them access to Mero's records without triggering a general alarm. Dawn revealed Skull Canyon Mine, sprawled across a natural amphitheater carved from the mountainside by seasonal floods and human ambition. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, while the steady thump of steam-powered machinery echoed from depths where men labored to extract gold from reluctant stone. The mine office sat apart from other buildings, on a slight rise, its log walls and barred windows giving it the appearance of a frontier fortress. From their vantage point on a ridge nearly a mile away, they could see guards posted at strategic locations throughout the complex. Mero was taking no chances with security, which suggested he knew exactly how damaging his office records might prove if they fell into the wrong hands. 4 guards on the office building. Ohiteka reported studying the scene through his cavalry spyglass. 2 at the main gate, 6 more patrolling the perimeter, plus whatever men are working inside the mine itself. "Too many for a direct assault," Dr. Henry observed. "We'd be cut down before we got within 100 yards of the building." "Then we don't assault," Cora said, an idea forming in her mind. "We create a distraction that draws the guards away from the office, then slip in during the confusion." What she proposed was audacious to the point of madness, using her knowledge of mining techniques to create a controlled explosion in one of the mine's secondary shafts, far enough from the main workings to avoid killing innocent miners, but spectacular enough to draw every available man to the rescue effort. "It's dangerous beyond description," Henry protested. "A miscalculation in the charges could bring down half the mountain. And doing nothing guarantees that Mero wins, and my father's death means nothing." Cora replied with steel in her voice. "I'd rather die trying than live, knowing I didn't have the courage to seek justice." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mining camp, they put their desperate plan into motion. using black powder stolen from a supply shed and fuses cut to precise lengths. Cora placed charges in an abandoned drift that would create maximum noise and dust with minimal actual damage. The explosion, when it came, was everything they had hoped for and more. The roar echoed throughout the canyon like the voice of an angry god, while a column of dust and debris rose into the sky like a signal fire visible for miles. Within minutes, every available man in the camp was running toward the mine entrance with rescue equipment and medical supplies. In the chaos that followed, with guards abandoning their posts to help with the rescue effort, the three infiltrators made their way to the office building through shadows and blind spots that Ohiteka's military experience had identified during their day-long surveillance. The office door was locked, but Dr. Henry's medical tools proved surprisingly effective at defeating frontier security measures. Within minutes, they were inside Merrow's private sanctum, searching through files and correspondence by lamplight, while the sounds of frantic rescue activity echoed from the mine entrance. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Merrow's files contained detailed records of bribes paid to territorial officials' instructions for the elimination of troublesome claim holders, and most damning of all, correspondence with a network of killers who operated throughout the Western Territories under various assumed names and identities. But it was the letter they found in Merrow's personal safe that provided the final piece of the puzzle, a communication dated just 2 weeks earlier, addressed to Zed Vaklovic, also known as H. Harrison, and containing specific instructions for the capture or elimination of the Moravec girl and her Indian protector. "He's been hunting you with family knowledge all along," Henry said grimly as they studied the correspondence. "Your uncle has been Merrow's creature for years, feeding him information about every family in the territory who might pose a threat to his operations." Before Cora could respond to this confirmation of her worst suspicions, the sound of approaching boots echoed from the building's front entrance. Their presence had been discovered, and now they were trapped in the heart of enemy territory, with evidence that could hang half the territorial government, but no way to escape with it. The confrontation they had been avoiding throughout their desperate journey was about to begin, and this time there would be no running, no clever strategies, no miraculous escapes. This time justice and corruption would meet face to face, and only one would survive the encounter. The office door burst open with violent force, admitting a flood of armed men, led by the scarred figure that haunted Cora's nightmares. Hook-Hand Harry stood framed in the doorway, like an avatar of vengeance, his metal appendage gleaming in the lamplight, while his pale eyes swept the room with predatory intensity. But now, with the truth laid bare in Merrow's correspondence, Cora saw past the scars and altered features to the face she had known in childhood. The bone structure was the same, the set of the shoulders, the way he favored his left side, all exactly as she remembered from Uncle Zachary's visits to their home before her father's death. "Well, well," Harry said, his voice carrying that faint Czech accent she had been too frightened to recognize before. Little Cora, all grown up and making trouble just like her papa. He stepped into the room, followed by 6 heavily armed men who spread out to block any possibility of escape. "Been a long chase, niece. Time to come home." The word niece hit Cora like a physical blow, confirming what she had already known, but hoped against hope might be wrong. This man, this killer who had hunted her across the territory, was her own blood, her father's brother, transformed by greed and violence into something barely recognizable as human. "Uncle Zachary." She whispered the name, feeling like poison on her tongue. "Nobody's called me that name in years." Harry replied with something that might have been nostalgia. As he spoke, he absently rubbed his remaining hand against his thigh, that familiar nervous gesture that had haunted her memories. Zachary Vaxlovic died the same night your papa did, buried under tons of rock along with all his gambling debts and foolish notions about family loyalty. You killed him. Cora said the words more statement than question. Your own brother. I saved him from a life of poverty and pointless struggle, Harry corrected with casual brutality. Václav was always too soft, too concerned with doing the right thing instead of the profitable thing. He could have been rich, could have been a partner in Mero's empire, but he chose to cling to his precious principles instead. Ohiteka had been standing perfectly still during this exchange, his hands empty, but positioned to reach his weapons in an instant. Dr. Henry clutched his medical bag as if it might provide protection against the guns trained on them from multiple directions. The water rights, Henry said, understanding, flooding his voice. You told Mero about Václav's claims before he could file them properly. I told Mero about a lot of things, Harry confirmed with ugly pride. Every family secret, every financial difficulty, every weakness that could be exploited. Information is valuable, Doctor, especially when it comes from someone the Marks trust completely. The betrayal went deeper than Cora had imagined. Not only had Zachary arranged her father's murder, he had been feeding information about the entire immigrant community to Mero, for years identifying targets for exploitation and elimination, with the intimate knowledge that only family could possess. Why? She asked, though she already knew the answer would bring no satisfaction. Money, of course, and power and the respect that comes from being feared rather than pitied. Harry's scarred face twisted into something resembling a smile. Do you know what it's like to be the younger brother, always living in the shadow of someone everyone considers the good one? Always hearing about St. Václav and his perfect daughter while Zachary the gambler gets nothing but disapproval and lectures about responsibility. So you destroyed everything he built out of jealousy. I transformed it into something profitable. This whole territory is going to be mine, and Mero's within 5 years, every mine, every water source, every acre of decent farmland. Your papa's death was just the beginning of a much larger enterprise. The casual way he spoke of genocide made Cora's vision blur with rage. But even as fury threatened to overwhelm her, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. Several of Harry's men were shifting uncomfortably, their faces showing the kind of moral unease that came from hearing truths they had preferred not to acknowledge. How much is he paying you? She asked the gunman, directly ignoring Harry's snarl of anger. How much is your share of this blood money he's so proud of? Shut up, girl, Harry snapped, but she had already seen the answer in their faces. He's keeping most of it for himself, isn't he? You're doing the killing while he and Mero collect the profits. How many of you have families back in the settlements? How many have children the same age I was when he murdered my father? I said shut up. Harry's hook gleamed as he raised it threateningly, but Cora pressed her advantage. Look at his correspondence, she said, gesturing toward the scattered papers on Mero's desk. See how much money is flowing through this operation, then ask yourselves how much of it you've actually seen. You're tools to him, just like I was a tool, just like my father was an obstacle to be removed. The doubt in their faces was becoming something more dangerous, anger at being used and betrayed by a man who saw them as expendable assets rather than partners. 2 of the gunmen actually lowered their weapons slightly, while the others seemed paralyzed by uncertainty. Harry, seeing the shift in his men's loyalty, made a fatal mistake. Instead of trying to regain their trust, he chose to reassert his dominance through violence. I don't need them to believe in the cause, he snarled, drawing his revolver and pointing it at Cora's chest. I just need them to follow orders and collect their pay, starting with bringing Mero his bride dead or alive. It was Ohiteka who moved first, his hand finding his knife, and sending it flying across the room in a single fluid motion. The blade took Harry in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his shot wild. Before the scarred man could recover, the Lakota Warrior had closed the distance between them. What followed was not the clean, heroic combat of dime novels, but the brutal, desperate struggle of men fighting for their lives in close quarters. Harry's hook made him dangerous at close range, but Ohiteka's military training and superior physical condition gradually gave him the advantage. Meanwhile, Dr. Henry and Cora dealt with Harry's increasingly confused subordinates, some of whom were beginning to question whether they were on the right side of the conflict. Two of the gunmen lowered their weapons entirely, while the others seemed paralyzed by uncertainty. During the chaotic melee, as Ohiteka and Harry crashed against Merrow's desk, scattering papers across the floor, Cora saw something that made her heart race with hope rather than fear. Among the correspondence was evidence of exactly the kind of systematic corruption they needed to bring federal authorities into the case. But the fight was far from over. Harry, despite his wounds, managed to break free from Ohiteka's grip and scramble toward a second revolver he kept hidden behind the desk. His hook scraped against wood as he reached for the weapon, his face twisted with murderous intent. "You should have stayed on your reservation, savage," he gasped, blood running down his arm. "Should have let sleeping dogs lie instead of playing hero for my ungrateful niece." Ohiteka, breathing hard from the struggle, positioned himself between Harry and Cora with protective instinct. Some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. Noble words from a man about to die. Harry replied, his remaining hand closing on the pistol grip. But it was Cora who ended the confrontation, not with violence, but with words that cut deeper than any blade. "Papa tried to make a deal with Merrow," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I found the letter, Uncle Zachary. He was going to sell the water rights and run away rather than fight. He was scared just like you always said he was." Harry's hand froze on the weapon, his pale eyes widening with something that might have been shock. "You're lying." He wrote to Merrow, offering to negotiate. "Papa was ready to abandon everything he believed in to keep me safe." Cora's voice grew stronger with each word. "But he never sent the letter. In the end, he chose to fight rather than run. He died trying to protect what mattered, while you lived by betraying everyone who ever loved you." The words hit Harry like physical blows, stripping away the justifications he had built around his crimes. For a moment, the scarred killer disappeared, replaced by a broken man who had sold his soul for gold and found it wasn't worth the price. "He always thought he was better than me," Harry whispered, his voice cracking with old pain. "Saint Václav, who never made a mistake, never took a risk, never understood what it was like to lose everything on a turn of the cards." "He understood loss," Cora replied with quiet certainty. "He lost his country, his language, his way of life when he came to America. But he didn't let that loss make him cruel. He used it to build something better for his daughter." Harry stared at her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she had become, rather than the frightened child he remembered. When he finally moved, it was not to draw his weapon, but to slump against the desk in defeat. "You look like him," he said, his voice barely audible. "When he was young, before America wore him down. Before I—" He never finished the sentence. Dr. Henry, seeing an opportunity to end the standoff without more bloodshed, stepped forward with his medical bag. "It's over, Zachary," he said gently. "Let me tend those wounds, and we'll see about getting you a fair trial instead of a rope." But even as the immediate danger passed, the sound of approaching horses warned them that their ordeal was far from finished. Octavius Merrow himself was arriving with reinforcements, and the final confrontation between justice and corruption was about to begin. The battle for Skull Canyon Mine and the soul of the Dakota Territory had only just started. The sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder as Octavius Merrow approached with what sounded like a small army, their horses' iron shoes striking sparks from the rocky ground. Through the office windows, Cora could see torches moving in the darkness, carried by men who had been summoned from every corner of Merrow's empire for what promised to be the final reckoning. 20 riders, maybe more. Ohiteka reported, peering through a gap in the shutters. All armed, all moving with purpose. They mean to end this tonight. Dr. Henry had managed to bind Harry's wounds with strips torn from his own shirt, though the former Zachary Vaxlovic remained slumped against the desk, his remaining hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Whatever fight had been in him seemed to have died with Cora's revelation about her father's unsent letter. "There's a back way out?" one of Harry's former subordinates offered hesitantly. The man, a grizzled veteran of frontier violence named Pete Lawson, had clearly decided that loyalty to a broken employer was worth less than survival. "Service tunnel that leads to the mine entrance. Could get you clear before Merrow arrives. And leave the evidence behind." Cora shook her head firmly. "This is our only chance to expose the whole conspiracy. If we run now, Merrow wins and my father's death means nothing." "Better a meaningless death than no death at all," Harry said bitterly, his voice thick with pain and self-loathing. "Merrow's got enough firepower out there to reduce this building to kindling. You're brave, niece, but you're not bulletproof." But Ohiteka was studying the office layout with the tactical eye of a man who had survived more desperate situations than most. The building's solid timber built to withstand winter storms. Narrow windows, thick walls, only 2 entrances. Could hold out for a while if we had to. "Against 20 armed men?" Dr. Henry asked skeptically. "Against 20 men who don't want to die for another man's greed." Cora corrected an idea forming in her mind. "Most of Merrow's riders are hired guns, not crusaders. They'll fight for money, but not if the cost gets too high." What she proposed was audacious to the point of madness. Instead of fleeing or surrendering, they would make their stand in the office building and use Merrow's own correspondence against him. If they could reveal the full extent of his crimes to his own men, they might turn the hunters into allies. "You're talking about a siege," Henry protested. "We have perhaps a dozen bullets between us and no food or water. How long do you think we can hold out?" "Long enough," Cora replied with grim determination. "Because help is coming." She had been examining Merrow's files while the others talked, and what she had found gave her hope. Among the correspondence was a letter from federal authorities in Washington announcing the arrival of a territorial inspector to investigate reports of mining fraud and corruption. The inspector was due to arrive in the Black Hills within days, armed with federal warrants and the authority to clean house from top to bottom. "Marshal Blake Morrison," she read from the letter. "Special investigator for the Department of Interior, tasked with examining irregularities in territorial land and water rights administration. Expected arrival November 15th. "That's tomorrow," Henry said with amazement. "Which means all we have to do is survive until morning," Ohiteka observed. "Simple enough, assuming Merrow doesn't decide to burn us out or bring up one of his mining charges to blow the building apart." Outside, the sound of horses had stopped, replaced by the murmur of voices, as Merrow organized his forces for what he undoubtedly expected to be a quick and decisive assault. Torchlight flickered through the windows, casting dancing shadows on the walls as armed men took positions around the building. Then Merrow's voice cut through the night air with the authority of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "You in the office, I know you're listening. This is Octavius Merrow, and I'm here to collect what's mine by right of law and contract. Send out the girl and any documents you may have taken, and I'll consider letting the rest of you ride away with your lives." Cora moved to the shattered front window, keeping low to avoid presenting a target for any nervous gunman. "I'm not your property, Mr. Merrow, and these documents prove you're a murderer and a thief." "Strong words from a dead woman," Merrow replied coldly. "You have 1 minute to reconsider before I order my men to reduce that building to ashes with you inside it." But instead of surrender, Cora did something that caught everyone by surprise. She began reading aloud from Merrow's correspondence, her voice carrying clearly across the mining camp in the still night air. Letter dated October 2, 1885, from Octavius Merrow to Territorial Judge Samuel Hartford, she called out. Quote, "The enclosed payment should ensure favorable rulings on any land disputes that come before your court. Remember that dead men file no appeals and live judges eat regular meals." End quote. The effect was immediate and electric. Even in the darkness, she could sense the shift in mood among Merrow's men as they heard evidence of corruption that implicated not just their employer, but the entire territorial legal system. Letter dated September 15, 1885. She continued, "To Sheriff David Sutton, the Mueller problem has been resolved permanently. Arrange for the usual accident report and ensure no federal investigators get involved. Your continued cooperation is worth $50 per month plus bonuses for special services." This time, several of Merrow's men actually lowered their weapons, and their faces showing the kind of moral unease that came from learning they had been working for something far worse than simple claim jumping or business rivalry. "She's lying," Merrow shouted, but his voice carried a note of desperation that undermined his authority. "Those documents are forgeries created to discredit honest businessmen and corrupt territorial officials." But Cora was just getting started. Letter by letter, document by document, she laid bare the full extent of Merrow's criminal empire, reading evidence of systematic murder, bribery, and fraud that had cost dozens of lives and corrupted half the territorial government. The revelation that broke Merrow's hold over his men completely was a detailed accounting of money owed to various hired guns, showing that most of them had been cheated out of promised payments, while Merrow accumulated wealth from their violence. Gunman Pete Lawson owed $47 for services rendered, she read. Gunman Thomas Creek owed $62 plus expenses. Gunman William Cray owed $35 for elimination of Heinrich Mueller. By the time she finished reading, the accounting half of Merrow's force had laid down their weapons entirely, while the others seemed paralyzed by uncertainty about their proper course of action. The mine owner's carefully constructed army was crumbling as surely as his empire of corruption. "You fools!" Merrow screamed at his remaining supporters. "She's turning you against your own interests. Think of the money we've made, the power we've built. Are you going to throw it all away for the words of some immigrant girl and her pet savage?" But his words rang hollow in the night air, and even his most loyal subordinates could see that the time for such appeals had passed. The evidence was overwhelming, the corruption undeniable, and the federal investigation that would inevitably follow would spare no one who had participated in the conspiracy. It was then that salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. The sound of horses approaching from the direction of the main road announced the arrival of a new force. But these riders carried the authority of federal law rather than territorial corruption. Marshal Blake Morrison had arrived early, alerted by telegraph messages from concerned citizens who had witnessed the events in Bismarck and recognized the implications for territorial governance. "This is Marshal Blake Morrison of the federal court," a commanding voice called out across the mining camp. Riding with him was an inspector from the Department of the Interior's General Land Office, present to audit land filings and water rights records, while the marshal executed federal warrants. By order of the Department of Interior, this operation is under federal investigation. All persons involved in illegal activities will surrender immediately, or face the full weight of federal justice. The transformation was immediate and complete. Merrow's remaining supporters laid down their weapons with the practical resignation of men who understood that fighting federal marshals was tantamount to suicide. The mine owner himself, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him like a house built on sand, could only watch in stunned silence as his world fell apart. Within an hour, federal agents had secured the mining camp and begun the process of collecting evidence and taking statements from witnesses. Merrow was placed under arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, while his surviving subordinates were held as material witnesses in what promised to be the most significant corruption trial in territorial history. But for Cora, the most satisfying moment came when Marshal Morrison examined the water rights documents that had cost her father his life and pronounced them completely legitimate and legally binding. "Miss Moravec," he said formally, "you are hereby recognized as the legal owner of water rights to Red Oak Creek and its tributaries as filed by your father in March of 1880. The territorial government will provide full support for the enforcement of your claims." As dawn broke over the black hills painting the mountains in shades of gold, and Rose Cora stood on the porch of Merrow's former office and watched federal agents load the last of the evidence into wagons bound for the territorial capital. Justice had finally come to the Dakota Territory, but the cost had been higher than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Henry emerged from the building with his medical bag, having spent the night treating the wounded from both sides of the conflict. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had seen right triumph over wrong. "What will you do now?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch steps. "Build something worth having." Cora replied, her hand finding Ohiteka's where he stood beside her. "Something my father would have been proud of." The Lakota Warrior's fingers interlaced with hers, warm and strong, and steady, a promise of partnership that went deeper than simple protection or shared danger. When she looked up at him, she saw her own feelings reflected in his dark eyes, along with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "The water rights are yours now," he said quietly. "What you do with them will determine whether your father's sacrifice had meaning." "Our water rights," she corrected, squeezing his hand gently. "And our decision about what to build with them." As the sun climbed higher in the clear Dakota sky, Cora Moravec felt the last of her childhood fears fade away, replaced by the confidence of a woman who had faced down corruption and emerged victorious. The frightened girl who had fled a forced marriage was gone, transformed into someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding difficult choices, but from making them with courage and conviction. 6 months later, the Red Oak Creek Cooperative was supplying clean water to settlements throughout the Black Hills, its profits shared among the immigrant families who had supported Cora's fight for justice. The mine that had been the center of Merrow's empire was operated as a collective venture with working conditions and wages that set new standards for the industry. But it was on a quiet evening in late spring, as Cora and Ohiteka sat on the porch of the house he had built beside the creek, that the final chapter of their story was written. "Federal appointment came through," she said, showing him the letter that had arrived that morning. It was an unusual appointment for the era, justified in writing by affidavits of service endorsements from the federal court and the Interior Department's stated need for trustworthy field investigators. Special Agent for Mining and Water Rights, responsible for investigating fraud throughout the Western Territories. "Important work," he observed, though she could hear the question in his voice. "Work that would take me away from here for months at a time. Away from the cooperative, away from everything we've built." She set the letter aside and looked at him with eyes that held all the love and determination that had sustained them through their darkest hours. "Away from you. Then decline it. Unless you came with me." words came out in a rush, carrying with them the weight of everything she had been afraid to say. "As my deputy, my partner, my husband, if you'll have me." Ohiteka's response was to pull her into his arms, with the gentle strength that had been her anchor through every storm. When he kissed her, it was with the patience of a man who had learned that the best things in life were worth waiting for. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words finally spoken aloud after months of being communicated through glances and touches and shared danger. "And I love you," he replied, his voice carrying the certainty of a promise that would last a lifetime. "From the moment you stood up to your uncle with nothing but courage to protect you." They were married by a territorial judge, with Marshal Morrison serving as a witness, with the entire water cooperative serving as witnesses, to vows that bound together not just two hearts, but two communities that had learned to find strength in unity. Their wedding dance was performed to Czech melodies played on fiddles and Lakota drums, a fusion of cultures that reflected the future they were building together. The federal appointment came with authority to establish regional offices throughout the West, and within 5 years, the Moravec Swift Elk Agency had become synonymous with honest law enforcement and protection of settlers' rights. Their success was built not on violence or intimidation, but on the simple principle that justice should be available to everyone, regardless of their wealth or connections. But it was during quiet evenings beside Red Oak Creek, with the water running clear and swift toward its junction with the Missouri, that Cora found her greatest satisfaction. The creek that had nearly claimed her life during their desperate journey had become the source of their prosperity. The promise made to a grieving child had become the foundation of a life worth living. Her father's dream that, in America, even a poor man's daughter could choose her own destiny had finally been fulfilled. But the fulfillment had come not through luck or charity, but through the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure, and the kind of courage that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. As the first stars appeared in the Dakota sky and the sounds of evening settled around their home, Cora felt a completeness that had everything to do with beginnings and nothing to do with endings. Her story was not finished, it was just entering its most important chapter, the one where she would help write the laws that would protect other daughters from the kind of exploitation that had nearly destroyed her. The American dream, earned through blood and sacrifice, love and determination, was finally theirs to keep and to share. And in a territory where justice had once been for sale to the highest bidder, the sound of clear water flowing over honest stone carried the promise that some things were indeed worth fighting for, no matter the cost.